I used to think Clint was the strongest man I had ever met until I saw them type the word female into his file. That sentence, quoted from the secret audio tapes Burt Reynolds left behind in the final months of his life, made anyone who ever believed in Hollywood's myth of masculinity fall silent. The man who stood 6 feet 4 inches with shoulders like stone walls and a voice that rumbled like thunder rolling off the Rockies. The man America celebrated as the embodiment of the true cowboy had once been turned into a punchline inside rooms the public would never see. On the tape, Burt reveals a chain of shocking truths, an internal studio file that deliberately misgendered Clint Walker, an underground war of resentment with Warner Brothers, and the shame Burt carried for half a century for staying silent. There are things I can't take to the grave. So why did Burt Reynolds only dare to speak the truth at the very end of his life? We have to begin where every secret was finally unlocked, his final recording. Before they smeared him with a piece of paper, they tried to break him with a contract. Burt Reynolds' voice on his final recording sinks low as if he were reading out a verdict he once watched helplessly unfold. Clint was considered a rebel star before the term rebel star even existed. In the 1950s, Clint Walker was pure gold for Warner Brothers, a star the studio wanted to control from his breathing to every hour he worked. Cheyenne topped every rating chart, turning Clint into an American icon. But behind the spotlight was a battle the audience never saw. A principled actor facing off against a giant entertainment empire, Clint believed his salary was far below the value he brought. The shooting schedules exhausted him and the contract bound him like chains. And he refused to sign, refused to stay quiet, refused to behave. Burt recalls that in one closed-door meeting, Clint stood up, looked straight at the Warner Brothers executives, and said, "I don't sell my soul to anyone. If I'm going to work, it has to be fair." The room went cold. Hollywood wasn't used to actors talking back. And Clint didn't just talk back, he stopped working for nearly 2 years. The entire studio staggered, broadcast schedules fell apart, productions froze, and millions evaporated each month. Clint had triggered a bomb the studio system era had never seen. And like every empire that has been challenged, Hollywood retaliated brutally. Warner Brothers froze Clint completely. No new roles, no new contracts. Directors whispered behind his back, "He's difficult, too stubborn, acts like Cheyenne in real life." An invisible label was stamped on him. Troublemaker. From then on, Clint became a target, and a target only needs the right moment to be taken down. Burt pauses for a beat on the tape, then speaks as if releasing an old ghost. They hated him, not because he was wrong, but because he wouldn't bow. And then he whispers the line that opens the door to the next dark chapter, a chapter Burt never spoke of publicly. The weapon came as a single piece of paper. One line, 2 words, female. Studios didn't just control Clint with contracts. They controlled him by turning him into a target. Burt Reynolds says this on the tape with a steady voice. No rise, no drama. And that calmness makes each word fall like a slab of stone. He recalls a night he never forgot, even at the end of his life. A night that led him down into the basement of Warner Bros.' administrative wing. A place with no glamour, no red carpet, only the smell of old paper and metal file cabinets heavy as coffins. Holding records Hollywood never wanted the public to know existed. The manager said gently, "So, you can understand how the studio operates." But Burt immediately understood it wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. And just as he suspected, among stacks of dry clinical reports, he saw a name that made his hand go cold. Walker Norman Eugene Burt opened the file and the first line said everything. No mention of talent. No mention of the millions who tuned into Cheyenne every week. Instead, there were phrases more dangerous than any scandal in the studio era. Non-compliant with PR, refuses arranged dates, declines contract extension, retains independent legal counsel. And the phrase Burt repeats again and again, excessive independence. Too independent. Independent enough to be a threat. Honest enough to be considered hostile. In the studio system, that wasn't a virtue. It was a declaration of war. Clint didn't curse anyone, didn't stage rebellions, but his integrity shattered the unspoken rule. The studio is the father. The actor is the child. Burt says that in that meeting, no one discussed Clint's contributions, and no one mentioned the loyalty of the audience. They discussed only one thing: controlling public perception. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. One man in a monotone voice, as if reading an invoice, said the sentence Burt carried like a scar. "We can't fire him, but we can make it hard for him to stand." Another replied softly, almost casually, "If he won't behave, then make people stop seeing him as an icon." At the time, Burt didn't understand what they meant, but he remembered the feeling that something cruel was about to begin. And then it happened, with one typewriter click, one internal joke, one line that seemed harmless. And a dark chapter Hollywood never admitted to was born. In the gender field of Clint Walker's file, someone typed female. No one single word. But in the meeting room, it triggered a wave of laughter. Not because it was funny, but because it gave them the intoxicating feeling of striking at Hollywood's greatest masculine symbol. "That girl plays Cheyenne pretty well," someone quipped. And the room roared as if they'd thrown the first stone at Clint's monument. Burt did not laugh. On the tape, he says, "I looked at that word and knew immediately. They had found their weapon." Because rumors in Hollywood don't need newspapers. They don't need proof. They don't need anyone to claim them. They only need a smile to get started. And just as Burt describes, the rumor didn't explode like a bomb. It spread like smoke. Slow, sticky. No one admits they said it, but everyone repeats it. It slithered through the makeup rooms, drifted backstage, surfaced, and whispered exchanges between assistants. "You know, Clint's a little unusual," followed by giggles. The word female wasn't a joke. It was a message from the system. Anyone who defies the studio will have their image distorted. And for a man America saw as the embodiment of masculinity, doubt was the bullet aimed straight at his honor. No scandal needed, no press coverage required, just enough uncertainty about who Clint really was, and the icon would crumble. Burt pauses for a few seconds on the tape, a long silence tight as a wire stretched over a lifetime, before delivering the sentence that chills the listener. "The day they labeled Clint female was the day they decided he would never stand straight again." To Clint, it wasn't a mistake, not a joke. It was a sentence. And to Burt, it was the first time he saw clearly that Hollywood did not operate on truth. It operated on stories chosen specifically to break someone. But the thing that haunted Burt most wasn't the laughter in the meeting room. It was the moment Clint first heard the rumor, and the way he stood still, like a silent mountain being eroded by the wind without ever crying out. Burt recalls that it happened on a gray afternoon at Warner Ranch. Clint had just finished shooting a horseback scene, leather costume still dusty, sweat dotting his forehead, when a young lighting assistant rushed over and whispered into his ear the very thing the entire studio had been laughing about behind his back. Burt stood a few meters away and saw Clint's face change. Not flushed with anger, but paling like a man suddenly handed a sentence he never earned and could never defend himself against. Clint didn't speak. He only asked one question. Voice low, slow, and catching for a moment. Why would they say that? No one answered. Because the real answer, if spoken aloud, was too cruel to teach everyone else to obey. Burt says Clint turned away, walked toward a props truck, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat like a man who had aged 10 years in a single breath. No smashing things, no shouting, no blaming. Clint's silence weighed down the entire set, as if everyone suddenly realized the thin line between being a star and being a puppet of the system. But the system didn't stop. The rumor slipped out of the trailers off the lot and seeped into the bars of Burbank and Beverly Hills. Tabloid writers smelled bait and began scribbling poisonous insinuations. Clint's beauty is too perfect for a real man. Insiders claim Walker has a gender secret. No one made a direct accusation, but every line planted suspicion. And for a cowboy icon, suspicion alone was enough to crack the monument. The worst part, Burt says, is that Clint tried to pretend he wasn't bothered. He kept working, kept riding, kept smiling when fans asked for autographs. But in the eyes of that Wyoming man, there was a sadness no one fully grasped. The sadness of someone humiliated by something he never did. Burt remembers once walking into the makeup trailer and seeing Clint sitting alone, staring at his rough hands, whispering almost to himself, "What did I do wrong, besides telling the truth?" That question followed Burt for the rest of his life. He says Clint belongs to a generation of men who believed in honor. Not honor in magazines, but honor in the mirror every morning. And when that honor is stained by a malicious joke, there is no way to wash it off except to endure it in silence. The studio tried to bend him, Burt says, but they forgot that when you try to bend a tree from the wild, sometimes you break it. After that year, Clint worked less. Roles thinned out. Doors that once opened easily began closing. No one said the reason. No one mentioned the word female, but everyone knew. In Hollywood, once doubt sticks to someone, it never fully leaves. It clings like studio dust. The more you wipe, the deeper it sinks. Burt admits that for years he carried guilt because he stood there and did nothing. "I was young," he says on the tape. "I was scared of the system, scared of being frozen out like he was. I let Clint face it alone." Then Burt's voice drops like a man confessing. "If there's one thing I wish I could apologize for, it's this. Not to Hollywood, to Clint." But the tape leaves behind more than regret. It is a recognition that Clint Walker, the tall, powerful man who seemed unbreakable, had once been struck down, not by overt force, but by a whispered cruelty. Burt's final line in that section is almost a breath. "They thought they took him down, but Clint outlived every last person who laughed in that meeting room, and at the end, he was still the most decent man I ever knew. They called me a symbol of masculinity, but the person who taught me what a man is was Clint." Burt says this in a voice so low it sounds like a confession he'd never dared speak aloud in his entire life. The tape shifts to a clearer recording. No static, no distortion, as if this memory remains too sharp for time to fade. Burt is no longer Burt Reynolds. Not the man laughing on the Oscar stage. Not the convertible driving star of Smokey and the Bandit. Not the figure America saw as the strongest man in any room. In that moment, he speaks like a boy standing in the wings, watching the man he quietly learned from. "I always played the number one guy, but I learned everything about strength from Clint." He pauses for several seconds as though seeing a younger Burt, louder, cockier, trying to prove himself with jokes and theatrics. But Clint was different. Clint didn't raise his voice, didn't slam tables, didn't fight for the spotlight. He simply walked into a room and the silence that followed did the rest. "I used to think you had to be loud to be heard. Funny to be remembered." Clint just had to stand there and the whole room turned toward him. Burt explains that most people never knew about their quiet friendship because they never displayed it in front of cameras. But behind the scenes, after award shows, after champagne-soaked galas, Burt would see Clint walking down an empty hallway, bending down to pick up a handkerchief an elderly actress dropped, and returning it to her without anyone noticing. Hollywood never printed those things. They don't sell tickets. But to Burt, they were more dazzling than any Cheyenne horseback stunt. In a place like Hollywood, where everyone tries to be bigger, brighter, louder, Clint taught me a lesson I never understood before. A man isn't someone who makes others afraid. A man is someone who makes others feel valued. He recalls a cold night in the late 60s after a long party. In the parking lot, Clint was talking with a janitor. Not polite small talk, but genuine conversation. They spoke about the man's son's tuition, his sick wife, his night shifts. Clint listened, nodded, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Take care of yourself. Your family needs you healthy." Then, without waiting for attention, Clint quietly slipped an envelope of money into the man's coat pocket. Not for praise, not for publicity, just out of kindness. We had the same agent, worked for the same bosses, but Clint was the one who made me look at myself. He did the right thing, even when no one was watching. Burt lets out a soft laugh. Not the confident, charming laugh everyone knew, but the laugh of someone touched by a memory that softened his heart. "People think I was the masculinity icon. They are wrong. In Hollywood, there was only one real man, and that was Clint Walker." His voice becomes reverent, almost a late prayer of gratitude. Burt Reynolds, who once had everything, fame, money, power, myth, ends the memory with one simple truth. "He didn't teach me how to be famous. He taught me how to be someone I could look in the mirror and not look away from. And that is the hardest thing. I stayed silent, and it's that silence that shames me the most. The tape shifts again, this time sounding farther away, as if Burt Reynolds had stood up from his chair and sat back down at a different distance, closer to the memory, but farther from his defenses. A faint creak of wood, then a long breath. The kind of breath only uttered by someone who knows the truth he's about to speak won't lighten his heart. Only make him more honest. Burt's voice now is no longer the voice of the star who once made America laugh, nor the deep, commanding tone of the man who led the box office for years. This is the voice of an aging man facing himself. No agent, no press, no audience to entertain, only the truth. In Hollywood back then, he says softly, everyone knew their place. You either bowed or you were replaced. Studios held absolute power. Contracts, reputation, news, even the narrative of an actor's personal life. One comment to the wrong person could erase your career in 24 hours, and no one would bother asking why. Young Burt lived inside that system, breathed its air, brushed against rules everyone understood, but no one dared to speak aloud. And because of that, when the rumor about Clint began spreading like an oil slick through the makeup rooms, Burt, who understood exactly how cruel Hollywood's backstage could be, recognized it instantly as a strike, a cheap strike, but he still stayed silent. I knew it was wrong, Burt admits. I knew they were using a joke to hurt a good man, but he stops as if flipping through a memory that still tightens his chest. I didn't speak up. He tells on the tape about one particular moment. The moment when things could have gone in another direction. A studio manager walked up to him, voice gentle, eyes sharp as a blade. You're close to Clint. What do you think about all this? Burt, young and hungry to hold on to his position, lacking the power to stand against a system that could crush him in an instant, didn't defend Clint. He let out a weak laugh and made a harmless joke. A joke he would later describe as the first drop of oil in an ocean of regret. In that moment, I chose safety, Burt says. I chose to stand with the crowd. There is a long silence on the tape, not the kind meant to catch breath, the kind that belongs to someone staring at their younger self and not quite believing how cowardly they once were. When Burt speaks again, his voice is rough and cracked, not from age, but from a shame that never faded. I should have told them Clint wasn't a name you throw around for amusement, that they were hurting the kindest man I ever met. A harsh breath follows. The sound of anger finally pointed inward. I should have stood beside him just once. And Burt closes the confession with a line that presses down on the listener's chest. Clint deserved someone to shield him from those filthy words. And if I didn't tell the truth when I was young, then let me tell it now, no matter how late. His voice falls to a whisper. But silence is a sin, and it's the sin I carried all my life. Clint said one sentence, and in that moment, I understood why they never broke him. Burt begins this section in a low voice, as if the memory has never dimmed. It was a charity gala in the late 80s, he says. The kind of event where everyone wears tuxedos, everyone smiles, and everyone carries an invisible mask. Backstage was dimmer than the stage. The warm yellow light filtering through drapes, making everything look softer, warmer, but also more dishonest. Laughter from the hall echoed like ocean waves, loud, beautiful, and utterly unrelated to what was really happening behind the curtains. Clint stood there, a man nearly 6 feet 6 inches, broad-shouldered, straight-backed. Yet his presence made no noise. He stood like an old-growth tree, silent, steady, unshaken by mockery. On stage, he was an honored guest. Backstage, he was still the target, the convenient surface onto which smaller men projected their power through whispered insults. Burt walked toward him that night, carrying an awkward apology he'd rehearsed for 2 weeks. But standing in front of Clint, every word shrank into something unworthy of saying aloud. He muttered a few vague lines, half confession, half denial, trying to use humor to mask what he truly meant to say. Clint didn't interrupt. He simply tilted his head slightly, looking toward the stage lights, where applause crashed like waves from another world, a world oblivious to silent battles. Then he answered with just 2 words. I know. No blame, no suspicion, no demand for explanation, just the quiet truth of a man long accustomed to being misunderstood and still choosing to live untouched at his core. Burt, embarrassed, asked, "Are you angry?" Only then did Clint turn back. His eyes were still but not cold, like deep water, so calm that people forget there is an entire world beneath its surface. "I don't live to please them." The sentence hit Burt like a soft slap. Not because it was sharp, but because it was undeniable. Clint adjusted his collar, breathed in, and continued, voice low, but powerful enough to push the entire gala's noise into the background. "They can call me whatever they want, as long as when I look in the mirror, I don't see a coward." In that instant, Burt fell silent. Not the silence of speechlessness, the silence of someone suddenly exposed from the inside out. Clint wasn't talking about the studio, not about the rumor, not about Hollywood's cruelty. He was talking about himself. And that, Burt says, was what hurt the most. Because in that sentence, there was an unspoken truth. Clint had seen the cowardice in Burt's eyes clearly and had chosen not to say it aloud. Burt's eyes on the tape. The sigh of a man finally admitting the truth he avoided his entire life. When he said that, Burt confesses, "I realized I hadn't just stayed silent toward Clint. I'd stayed silent toward the man I wanted to become." He ends the segment with a line heavy as stone. "People think the worst pain comes from what others say about you. It doesn't. The worst pain is knowing you didn't say what was right. I carried too many roles and one truth I hid my whole life." By this point in the tape, Burt's voice has changed completely. It's low, raspy, and spent. No trace of the confidence or playfulness of the man who once made America laugh. This is the voice of someone finally touching the things he has avoided his entire life. He says he used to believe that time would make everything fade. Fame, failures, broken marriages, bankruptcies, long slips down the slope. All of it would eventually blur like an old photograph. But one thing never faded. The memory of how Hollywood treated people who refused to bend like Clint Walker. By the 2000s, when his health began to sag, weak heart, short breath, joints aching whenever the weather turned, his career cooled down like the last ash of a cigarette at the end of the day. Old friends were disappearing one by one, and the new talk shows were fast, young, and no longer understood the era he'd lived through. In those quiet stretches, the image of Clint came back. Not loud, not accusing, just standing there like a question he had never answered. He found himself thinking about Clint more and more, realizing that the older you get, the harder it is to lie to yourself. His silence back then, which had once seemed harmless, had become something that pressed on his chest heavier than any scandal or failure. On some nights after his 2010 heart surgery, he would sit alone in his small house in Florida, letting the TV play old episodes of Cheyenne. Whenever Clint appeared, he often muted the sound. Not to avoid his face, but because one sentence kept echoing in his mind, refusing to leave. "As long as I don't see a coward in the mirror," Clint had said. On the tape, Burt whispers, "I did see one, and I didn't like the man looking back at me." It's one of those rare moments when Burt Reynolds is no longer a star, no longer the legendary mustache, no longer a 1,000-watt charm. He's just an old man facing the moral debt he owes himself. A debt no contract, no statuette could ever erase. The tape ends with a soft click. No flowery farewell, no grand statement, just a small sentence that sounds like it's been pulled from the deepest place inside him. "I wish I'd talked to him about it sooner." They can fabricate a file, but they can't fabricate a decent life. The tape moves into its final minutes. No more heavy breaths. No more hesitation. Burt's voice becomes clearer, as if he has finally found the one thing he spent his whole life searching for, an answer. They can write whatever they want in a file. But the only thing that remains is how he lived and how he treated people. There is no raspy laugh, no hint of the mischievous, wisecracking Burt. Only pure, unmuddied respect, so absolute that the listener can't help but fall silent. Clint Walker, the man the Warner Brothers PR department once deemed hard to manage. The man mocked by an entire system through a memo that read gender female. The man who almost never fought back, never sued, never shouted. He simply stood tall and lived the way he believed was right. Burt says he didn't need scandals. He didn't need dirty PR. He didn't need tricks to get attention. Clint just worked and was kind. Hollywood thought that was a weakness, but really it was his strength. His voice slows, carrying the tone of someone rewinding the film reel of their own life. I was the opposite. Loud, reckless, flawed. I stood up and fell down over and over. My life was a beautiful mess. It sounds like he might be smiling at that line, but it's not pride. It's the smile of someone who finally sees himself clearly. He wasn't like that. Clint was quiet, reserved. He'd walk into a room and everyone went silent, not from fear, but from respect. On the tape, Burt taps the table, a dry wooden thud, like a stamp sealing the truth he is about to speak. He was the kind of man I wanted to be. Not the strongest man, not the most famous, not the most heavily marketed, but the man who knew who he was and didn't let Hollywood distort that. Burt continues, I spent my whole life trying to make people laugh, trying to be loved, to be remembered. Clint, he didn't need anyone to love him. He just needed to keep his word to himself. A long silence follows. Then he speaks slowly, almost a whisper. Turns out that's what a real man is. Not muscle, not fame, not the image the studio builds, but the ability to stand firm even when the whole world calls you by a name that isn't yours. At the end of the tape, Burt closes the entire confession with a sentence the listener will never forget. If there's a next life, I hope I'm as brave as he was. Not stronger, just a little less cowardly. Then the tape cuts off. No music, no farewell, only the truth. Bare, sorrowful, and beautiful in the way only an old man's honesty can be. The tape ends, leaving behind a silence as long as Burt Reynolds' final years. When he no longer chased spotlights, no longer pretended to be strong, no longer hid his remorse behind laughter, only a man settling a debt he had carried for half a century. This story isn't meant to smear Hollywood. It isn't meant to paint heroes or victims. And it certainly isn't meant to revive a cheap rumor the studio system once used to turn a man into a joke. It exists for one reason, to remind us that some truths outlive fame. Some consciences weigh more than Oscars, and some men stand tall without ever needing to defend themselves. Clint Walker left behind no scandals, no dramatic memoir, no explanation. What he left behind was how he lived. Upright, kind, silent, but never bowed by humiliation. Burt Reynolds left behind something else. A quiet confession hidden in a tape he may never have intended anyone to hear. 2 men, 2 lives, 2 lessons about honor in an era when Hollywood was great at building legends and just as skilled at destroying them. If this story made you rethink what lies behind Hollywood's bright lights, and if it reminded you that every legend has a shadow history the world tries to hide, leave a comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell because we're just getting started. There are still tapes left unopened, files still sealed, and secrets Hollywood never wanted you to